her hands now empty, remembered the weight of who was no longer there. In the silence of her solitude, Maite watched the storm through the steamy window like someone contemplating a future without a horizon. But destiny holds secrets that not even the fiercest tempest can erase. Sometimes in the eyes of a stranger, we find the reflection of a new dawn, and in their calloused hands, the silent promise that not all is lost. Between revelations in the rain and silences that say more than a thousand words, discover how two wounded souls can build a shelter stronger than any storm. If this story touches your heart, gift us a like. Each one is like a small light of hope that drives us to continue sharing stories that embrace the soul. And tell us, how do you think this story of love, loss, and redemption will end? Your life experience makes your voice special. Share it with us. The sky was breaking into fragments of light and shadow over Frontera do Riacho. The storm, relentless, as fate itself, lashed the saloon windows with liquid fingers that seemed to want to wrench secrets from the walls. Maite Solano observed how the drops formed erratic paths on the glass, as unpredictable as the turn her life was about to take. Her hands, knowledgeable about the healing properties of every herb in the valley, now trembled, holding a secret too heavy. The midwife's words reverberated in her mind, like the thunder outside. "You're expecting a child." The small bundle of life inside her was barely weeks old, but had already altered the course of her existence. While the piano music partially drowned the roar of the storm, Maite scrutinized the corner where Ernesto Valdez remained apart. As always, the man with the worn hat, of silent presence but impossible to ignore. His eyes, the dark amber color of the whiskey he held, reflected the flickering flames of the oil lamps. Something broke inside Maite at that moment. It wasn't fear, but determination. She rose with the same delicacy with which she used to collect arnica flowers at dawn. The salon, crowded with the annual spring celebration, gradually reduced its bustle until it became an expectant murmur. Some faces turned toward her as she advanced, her light blue dress waving like gentle water around her ankles. When she reached Ernesto, time seemed to suspend between them. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated the entire town, bathing the scene in a ghostly light. "She said this child is yours," Maite pronounced, her voice clear as crystal crossing the space between them. The muscles in Ernesto's jaw visibly tensed. His eyes, always vigilant like a hawk's, widened for an instant before returning to their usual caution. The silence that followed weighed more than all the town's secrets combined. Maite felt the gazes fixed on her back. Curiosity, judgment, surprise. The smell of whiskey, tobacco, and cheap perfume mixed with the scent of wet earth that entered through the half-open windows. She felt like she was breathing in the storm itself. Ernesto's hands, those that tamed wild horses as if speaking to them in a secret language, stopped caressing the glass. A drop of sweat slid down his bronze temple when he finally stood up. "I understand," he said simply, with that deep voice he used so sparingly. These two words, pronounced under the thunder of a particularly violent clap, marked the beginning of something neither could foresee, something as unpredictable as the life now growing inside Maite. The days following the revelation in the saloon passed with the slowness of thick honey in winter. Maite stared at the flaking ceiling of her small room at the back of the herb shop, counting the cracks as if they were possible paths for her future. Her mind wandered to her mother, now just a memory and some yellowing photographs, who had faced a similar fate 2 decades earlier. "Men promise heaven when they seek earth," she used to tell her while braiding her hair black as a moonless night. The irony didn't escape Maite. Now she herself was the protagonist of a story she had sworn never to star in. The reflection in the rusted mirror returned a questioning look. Her hazel eyes, inherited from a grandmother she never knew, seemed to ask, "Will you be different? Will you break the cycle?" Outside, the town buzzed with rumors. Maite perceived it in conversations that died when she entered the bakery, in the furtive glances of the ladies after Mass, in the sudden interest, in buying her medicinal tinctures, as if her condition gave them additional magical properties. That afternoon, while classifying valerian roots in small bottles, the shop bell tinkled. Ernesto appeared under the doorframe, his silhouette cut against the golden light of dusk. For a moment he seemed like a mirage, an invention of her tired mind. "Miss Solano," he greeted, with a slight movement of his hat. The scent of leather, horse, and freshly cut grass invaded the small store, mixing with the perfume of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. "Mr. Valdez," she responded, her voice firmer than she felt. Ernesto took 2 steps toward the counter and deposited a small leather pouch. The metallic clink revealed its contents without need for words. "That's not necessary," said Maite, although her fingers involuntarily brushed the worn edge of the pouch. "It is for me," he replied, his gaze fixed on some point over her shoulder, as if fearing eye contact. A dense silence settled between them, populated by unformulated questions and answers that neither knew how to offer. "I have a cabin," Ernesto finally said, "at the edge of my property, by the stream. It's small, but—" The words seemed to evaporate on his lips. Maite perceived the effort each syllable cost this man of prolonged silences. She observed him carefully, the premature wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, the almost imperceptible scar above his left eyebrow, the calloused hands that now nervously played with the brim of his hat. "Thank you, but I haven't decided anything yet," she replied, her voice a whisper that caressed the words instead of pronouncing them. When Ernesto finally dared to look at her directly, something indefinable floated between them, as tangible as the golden dust that danced in the sunbeams filtering through the window. "Time is running," he murmured, before turning toward the door. That night, while the moon drew silver ghosts on the walls of her room, Maite caressed her, still flat belly. "What shall we do, little traveler?" she whispered. For the first time since the revelation, a solitary tear descended her cheek, not of sadness or fear, but of a strange and disconcerting hope. The path to the cabin wound through trembling aspens and wild sage bushes. Maite advanced with firm step, her small trunk of belongings swinging rhythmically against her hip. She had spent an entire week debating between her fierce independence and the practicality of accepting Ernesto's offer. A temporary decision, she had told herself while packing her herbs, books, and the shawl knitted by her mother. But inside, something whispered that temporary paths sometimes become permanent destinations. The cabin appeared like a revelation after a bend in the trail. Smaller than she had imagined, its weather-beaten wooden walls seemed to blend with the landscape. A thread of silver smoke ascended from the chimney, dancing against the pale morning sky. Ernesto was waiting on the porch, so motionless that he could have been confused with the beams supporting the roof. Seeing her, he stood up with the contained grace that characterized all his movements. "You came," he said, a statement more than a question. "Only until I find a better arrangement," she clarified, although the defensive tone she intended to use dissolved in the pine-scented air. The interior of the cabin revealed an unexpectedly welcoming simplicity. A bed with a patchwork quilt, an oak table with 2 mismatched chairs, rustic shelves holding some worn books. In the center, a stone fireplace radiated heat that seemed to welcome. On the mantelpiece, Maite noticed a small wooden carving, a wild horse with its mane in the wind. "I made it last night," Ernesto murmured, following her gaze. For the little one." The gesture, as unexpected as revealing, completely disarmed Maite. This rough man of few words had spent hours shaping wood, creating beauty with the same hands that tamed wild colts. "It's beautiful," she replied, brushing the polished figure with her fingers. Ernesto nodded briefly and headed for the door. "There are vegetables in the pantry, and fresh milk." Before Maite could thank him, he added, "I'll come tomorrow to bring more firewood. I don't need to come in." When the door closed behind him, Maite sat in one of the chairs, suddenly exhausted. The silence of the cabin wrapped around her like a long-awaited embrace. Through the window she observed Ernesto riding away, his silhouette cut against the immense prairie. That night, while preparing a mint infusion to calm the nausea that was beginning to manifest, Maite reflected on the invisible walls that Ernesto built around himself. Walls as high as those she herself had erected after seeing her mother wither away, waiting for a man who never returned. As she lay down, her hands rested on her belly. A gentle wind rocked the branches against the window, creating dancing shadows on the rustic walls. The scent of pine and damp earth filtered through the cracks, reminding her that she now lived on the edge, between solitude and company, between the town and the open countryside, between her past and a future that was beginning to take shape with uncertain but distinct strokes. Dr. Miranda Fuentes' office smelled of medicinal alcohol, and the dried herbs that Maite herself regularly provided. The whitewashed walls reflected the midday light, creating an almost ethereal environment where metal instruments gleamed with intimidating precision. Maite watched fascinated as the itinerant doctor, a woman with shrewd eyes and surprisingly delicate hands for someone who had served in the war, pressed a strange instrument against her barely bulging belly. The coldness of the metal contrasted with the heat emanating from her skin. "Breathe deeply, Miss Solano," the doctor indicated, with that voice that seemed accustomed to being obeyed. Maite closed her eyes, concentrating on the sound of her own breathing, on the beat of her heart that seemed to have accelerated since that day in the saloon. 3 months had passed since then, 3 months of adaptation to life in the cabin, to Ernesto's brief but constant visits, who always found some excuse to appear without really getting close. "Interesting," murmured the doctor, adjusting the position of the instrument. Something in her tone made Maite open her eyes suddenly. "Is something wrong?" Dr. Fuentes sketched an enigmatic smile while removing the stethoscope. "Depends on how you look at it. There are 2 heartbeats in there." "2?" The word hung in the air like an unexpected musical note. "Twins, Miss Solano. You are expecting 2 creatures." The world seemed to stop for an instant. Maite felt the room begin to slowly rotate around her, as if she had entered an invisible carousel. "Are you sure?" she finally managed to articulate. "As sure as the sun will rise tomorrow," replied the doctor, beginning to put away her instruments. "It's rare, but my ears don't deceive me. 2 hearts, 2 children." Maite dressed mechanically, her mind a whirlwind of images. 2 cribs, 2 mouths to feed, 2 lives to answer for. The news, far from doubling her concern, awakened in her a fierce determination she didn't know she possessed. Leaving the improvised consulting room, the town received her with its usual bustle. She didn't need to wait long to confirm that the news had begun to spread. The compassionate look of the baker, the poorly disguised whisper of 2 old women in the square, the sudden interest of the storekeeper in her health. Frontera do Riacho, with its innate ability to transform secrets into currency, was already digesting the new information. Maite walked with firm step toward the fabric store. If she was going to receive 2 children, she would need to prepare doubly. While examining a soft ivory cotton, she felt a presence at her back. "They say there." "Hartu." Ernesto's voice was barely audible. Maite turned slowly. The man seemed larger under the low ceiling of the store, his hat in his hands, revealing black hair with some premature gray at the temples. "Yes," she confirmed, holding his amber gaze. Something imperceptible changed in Ernesto's face. His hands, always sure when handling the reins of the most difficult horses, trembled slightly as they extended toward Maite's belly. He stopped halfway, as if remembering the invisible boundaries they had established. Maite, in an impulse she couldn't explain, took that rough hand and guided it to her abdomen. "They still can't be felt," she murmured, "but they're there." Ernesto's fingers spread over the fabric of her dress, warm and surprisingly gentle. For a fleeting moment, both shared something more intimate than any word, the awareness that life, relentless and generous, had decided to multiply between them. "2," he repeated, as if the word contained an entire universe. When Ernesto withdrew his hand, Maite perceived that something fundamental had changed between them. It wasn't love. That word seemed too big, too defined for what was just beginning to germinate, but it was something equally powerful. A shared responsibility, a future they could no longer imagine separately. That night, in the solitude of the cabin, Maite knitted 2 small caps while the moon poured its silver light over her hands. "We'll be 3, she whispered to the darkness. "No, we'll be 4, she corrected, including in her count that silent man who, without grandiloquent promises, was beginning to build a space in her life with the same patience with which he built fences or tamed horses. The harvest festival transformed Frontera do Riacho each year. Paper lanterns hung between the trees in the square, creating artificial constellations that competed with the starry sky. The aroma of baked apples, cinnamon, and caramel intertwined with the laughter and music that sprang from various corners. Maite, in a new dress that disguised her 4-month pregnancy, wandered among the stalls with a freedom she hadn't experienced for some time. The curious looks and whispers persisted, but had lost much of their power to make her uncomfortable. The Solano twins, That's what they already called them, although months remained until their arrival. Her story had gone from scandal to local legend in formation, especially since Dr. Fuentes' prediction had been confirmed in a second visit. While savoring a piece of apple pie, Maite heard a different melody filtering through the festive sounds. A guitar, played with unusual mastery, emitted notes that seemed to narrate stories without words. Intrigued, she followed that music to the back of the community barn. The vision left her motionless. Ernesto, seated on a hay bale, caressed the strings of a worn guitar with the same delicacy with which his hands had brushed her belly weeks earlier. His eyes were closed, his expression completely transformed, as if the music revealed a different man beneath the taciturn cowboy's shell. The song, melancholic and sweet at once, spoke of losses and reunions, of solitary paths and promising horizons. Maite held her breath, fearing to break the spell. When the last note vanished in the night air, Ernesto opened his eyes. The startle at seeing her was evident, as if he had been discovered in an act of nakedness. "I didn't know you played," said Maite. Approaching with measured steps, Ernesto placed the guitar at his side with reverential care. "My father taught me, a long time ago." "It's beautiful," she commented, sitting at a prudent distance on the same hay bale. "Why do you keep it a secret?" The silence that followed was as eloquent as the previous music. In the distance, the sounds of the festival continued, oblivious to the moment of intimacy developing in the shadows of the barn. "Some things are just for oneself," Ernesto finally responded. Maite nodded, understanding perfectly. She herself kept similar secrets, poems written by candlelight, dreams never shared, fears she didn't dare name aloud. Could you play something for them?" she asked, pointing to her belly with a shy gesture. The surprise on Ernesto's face was slowly replaced by something close to gratitude. He took the guitar again, and after a moment of doubt, began to play. This time the melody was different, light, hopeful, like spring water, flowing over polished stones. Maite closed her eyes, allowing the music to envelop her. Her hands rested on her belly, imagining that the notes filtered through her skin to reach the small beings growing inside. When the song ended, she opened her eyes to find Ernesto's gaze fixed on her, not on her belly but on her face, as if he were really seeing her for the first time. "My mother sang that song," he explained in a hoarse voice, "for me and my sister, before sleep." The mention of a sister, of a family he had never mentioned before, made Maite hold her breath. It was as if each note had loosened a brick in the wall that Ernesto maintained around his past. "It's a precious gift," she responded, feeling that the words were insufficient. Something indefinable floated between them then, as real as the stars over their heads, as fragile as the music that still vibrated in the air. They walked together back to the festival, not arm in arm, but close enough that their shadows intertwined. Under the light of the lanterns, people who saw them pass exchanged significant glances, but for the first time neither Maite nor Ernesto seemed to notice. That night, when he accompanied her to the cabin, they stopped at the threshold. Words seemed superfluous after the shared music. "Good night, Miss Solano," Ernesto finally said, with the formality he still maintained between them. "Maite," she replied. "My name is Maite." He nodded, as if he had just received a valuable gift. "Maite," he repeated, savoring the sound. As she watched him move away in the darkness, Maite understood that that night she had witnessed something extraordinary. Not only had she discovered Ernesto's hidden talent, but a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man who existed beyond the silent cowboy the town knew. Doña Clemencia Ortiz's house rose on the hill that dominated Frontera do Riacho, as imposing and severe as its owner. The high windows, always covered with heavy velvet curtains, seemed like vigilant eyes that missed nothing in the town. Maite climbed the marble steps with her heart beating in her throat. The matriarch's summons, a note written on perfumed paper and delivered by a child, admitted no refusals. "I expect you at 4 for tea. Family matters to discuss." The door opened before she knocked, revealing a servant with an expressionless face who led her through hallways decorated with portraits of people with severe gazes and ornaments that spoke of fortunes accumulated over generations. The living room where Doña Clemencia awaited was a perfect combination of opulence and sobriety. The old woman, erect in a brocade armchair like a queen on her throne, observed Maite with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance. "Sit down, child," she ordered, pointing to a nearby chair. "Tea is served." Maite obeyed, aware of the fragility of the porcelain that tinkled slightly due to the trembling of her hands. At 5 months pregnant, her rounded figure contrasted with the ascetic thinness of the old woman. "I suppose you wonder why I've called you," Doña Clemencia began, while serving chamomile tea in the cups. "I'm not known for socializing with people in your situation." The condescending tone made Maite tense her back. "My situation has a name, ma'am. I'm pregnant, not sick." An almost imperceptible smile curved the thin lips of the old woman. "Direct? Like her. I expected no less." "Like whom?" asked Maite, disconcerted. Doña Clemencia rose with surprising agility for her age and headed to an ornate sideboard. From one of the drawers she extracted an antique music box carved in dark wood with mother-of-pearl inlays. Upon opening it, a soft and nostalgic melody filled the room. Inside, on faded velvet, rested a cameo showing the profile of a young woman with disturbingly familiar features. "Like your grandmother," she finally replied. "My younger sister, Soledad." The world seemed to stop around Maite. "My grandmother? But my mother always said her mother died giving birth to her." "Your mother believed what she was told," replied Doña Clemencia, with a bitterness that seemed to have settled over decades. "The truth is more complex, as it tends to be." With precise gestures, the old woman extracted from the box several yellowed letters tied with a worn ribbon. "Soledad fell in love with an inappropriate man, a day laborer without name or fortune. Our father disinherited her and expelled her from the family when she refused to marry the landowner he had chosen." The words fell like stones in the quiet pond of the afternoon. Maite listened, unable to fully assimilate that this severe woman, this pillar of respectability in the town, was revealing herself to be her great-aunt. "My sister gave birth to your mother in poverty but with dignity," continued Doña Clemencia. "She died of fever when the child was barely 3 years old. The father, unable to raise her alone, left her at the orphanage in the neighboring county." "And you allowed it?" Indignation colored Maite's voice. The old woman's eyes hardened. "I didn't know until years later. By then, your mother had already been adopted by the Solanos. When I finally found her, she was already a young woman as stubborn as Soledad. She wanted nothing to do with me or this family." The silence that followed was charged with decades of regrets and obstinate pride. Maite observed the cameo again, recognizing in that delicate profile features she saw each morning in her own reflection. "Why are you telling me this now?" she finally asked. Doña Clemencia closed the music box, abruptly silencing the melody. "Because history seems to be repeating itself, child. You, pregnant with twins, without a ring on your finger. The difference is that you have the opportunity to break the cycle." "How?" "By accepting my help," replied the old woman with simplicity. "Not for charity, but by right of blood. Those children you carry are the last descendants of my family, whether you want it or not." Maite felt a wave of contradictory emotions: indignation at secrets kept for so long, confusion at this unexpected connection to the local aristocracy, and something more complex, the feeling that a void long present in her family history was beginning to fill. "I'm not seeking your fortune, ma'am," she finally said. "I know," replied Doña Clemencia with what seemed like a hint of respect. "But my great-nephews deserve to know their heritage, just as you deserve to know yours." When Maite left the mansion hours later, the sun was beginning to set, tinting Frontera do Riacho with copper and purple tones. In her pocket, the weight of the cameo, a reluctant gift from Doña Clemencia, seemed to represent not only the newly discovered past, but a future that was beginning to be rewritten. The path to the cabin never seemed so long. Her mind reviewed conversations with her mother, who had passed away years ago, looking for clues she might have overlooked, signs of this family secret that now revealed itself, like pieces of a puzzle too long incomplete. Upon arriving, she found Ernesto on the porch, carving another small wooden figurine in the dying light of dusk. His eyes, always attentive, immediately detected that something had changed in her. "Are you all right?" he asked, rising with concern. Maite extracted the cameo and opened it, showing him the face of the woman she never knew, but whose blood ran through her veins. "I have a family," she said simply. "A family I never knew existed." The sun punished the earth with relentless ferocity. July had arrived with a drought that turned the fields into dusty canvases, where green yielded day by day to ochre and yellowish tones. The streams, normally generous, were reduced to trembling threads of turbid water, where cattle crowded with growing desperation. Maite observed from the cabin window how a fine layer of dust settled on everything, transforming the world into a faded version of itself. Her medicinal plants, carefully transplanted from town, languished despite her efforts to keep them alive, using the water Ernesto brought daily from the well. Her 6th month of pregnancy coincided with this hostility of the climate, as if nature and her body competed in radical transformations. The mirror returned an image she barely recognized. Her belly, prominent and taut, contrasted with her arms and face, thinned by the persistent nausea that the drought seemed to intensify. "It's a bad omen," she had heard an old woman murmur in the grocery store days earlier. "2 children conceived out of wedlock, and now the earth refuses to give us sustenance." The words, pronounced loud enough to ensure Maite heard them, had penetrated more deeply than she was willing to admit. She wasn't superstitious. Her knowledge of medicinal herbs was based on observation and practice, not on rituals or spells, but the weight of the collective gaze was beginning to erode her determination as the wind eroded the parched earth. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Upon opening it, she found Josefina, the baker's youngest daughter, with reddened eyes and an expression of poorly disguised anguish. "My little brother has a very high fever," she explained hurriedly. "Father says it's divine punishment for the drought, but Mother sent me to find you in secret. She says your remedies are the only ones that can help." The irony didn't escape Maite. The same community that pointed to her as the cause of their misfortunes came to her seeking relief. However, the child's need was above any resentment. "Give me a moment," she responded, collecting her bag of herbs and some carefully labeled bottles. The path to town was a test of endurance. The sun fell heavily upon them as they advanced along the dusty path. Maite felt the weight of her pregnancy as never before, and the restless movements of the twins seemed to reflect her own discomfort. Upon reaching the bakery, the hostile gazes of some customers followed her to the back room. Mrs. Mendez, with pronounced dark circles and trembling hands, received her with barely disguised gratitude. "He's had a fever of 104 since last night," she explained, leading Maite to a cot where little Tomas tossed with flushed cheeks and agitated breathing. Maite worked methodically, preparing compresses of fresh herbs and an infusion of willow and mint. Her hands moved with precision, guided by knowledge. Inherited from generations of women who had found in nature answers that others sought in prayers and superstitions. While attending to the child, she heard fragments of conversation coming from the bakery. "If Mr. Valdez hadn't intervened, we would have lost all the cattle. Building something on his property, they say it's a house for her and the children. Against the Lord's will, those children will be born marked." The words intertwined with the monotonous buzzing of flies and the occasional crying of the sick child. Maite maintained her concentration on the task, deliberately ignoring the poison that filtered through the walls. When finally Tomas's fever began to subside, Maite collected her belongings. Mrs. Mendez tried to pay her, but she refused the money. "Save it for better times," she said simply. As she left, she found herself face to face with Mr. Mendez, whose eyes reflected a mixture of reluctant gratitude and persistent disapproval. "My wife says you saved our son," he stated in a harsh voice. "I only gave him what he needed," replied Maite. "The fever will come down completely by nightfall." The man nodded dryly. After a moment of hesitation, he added, "The town talks. They say it's your condition that has brought the drought." Maite held his gaze, feeling a new strength emerge from somewhere deep within her. "The earth has its cycles, Mr. Mendez, as women have ours. Neither you nor I control when it rains, but we both can decide how to treat others during difficult times." Without waiting for a response, Maite walked away, aware of the gazes that followed her from half-closed windows and half-open doors. The dust swirled at her passing, as if the earth itself responded to her newly discovered determination. Upon returning to the cabin, she found Ernesto hammering boards into what appeared to be the skeleton of a small but solid structure, about 50 meters from where she lived. "What are you building?" she asked, though the answer was beginning to form in her mind. Ernesto stopped, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his forearm. His shirt, soaked despite the dryness of the environment, clung to his torso, revealing the physical strength he normally concealed under his reserved attitude. "A house," he replied simply. "For you. For them." He made a vague gesture toward her belly. Why? The question sounded more vulnerable than she intended. Ernesto fixed his gaze on the cracked earth beneath his feet, as if searching for words buried in it. "Because," he began, the words emerging with difficulty, "because they deserve more than a borrowed cabin. They deserve a home." The simplicity of his response, devoid of grandiloquent promises or sentimental declarations, touched something deep in Maite. In a world where words were often used as counterfeit currency, Ernesto's silent acts shone with authenticity. "Thank you," she said, letting silence complete what words couldn't express. That night, while the heat persisted even in darkness, Maite observed the stars from the porch. The twins moved restlessly inside her, as if they perceived the accumulated tension of the day. "People fear what they don't understand," she whispered to them, caressing her belly. "But you will be born knowing you are loved, not feared." In the distance, occasional hammering indicated that Ernesto continued working under the light of an oil lamp. The sound, rhythmic and constant, mixed with the crickets and the distant howl of a coyote, composing a strange lullaby for the children growing protected inside her, still oblivious to a world that already judged them. Santiago Rivera's arrival in Frontera do Riacho always caused a commotion. His gleaming black carriage, pulled by purebred horses, advanced through the dusty streets like an apparition from another world, leaving in its wake a trail of whispers and speculations. The owner of the most extensive ranch in the county was a man of contrasts. His fortune, inherited and multiplied with relentless cunning, contrasted with the almost austere simplicity of his appearance. Tall, thin, with clear eyes that seemed to constantly assess the monetary value of everything they observed, Rivera was more respected than liked in the community. Maite didn't expect to find him in the herb shop she visited monthly to replenish her supplies. She found him examining with clinical curiosity the bottles of tinctures and extracts that Mrs. Morales kept meticulously organized. "Miss Solano," he greeted, his cultivated voice revealing an education that few in town could afford. "I was precisely hoping to find you." Maite, uncomfortable under Rivera's evaluating gaze, nodded briefly. Her 7th month of pregnancy made it impossible to hide her condition, and the simple dress she wore, though dignified, contrasted notably with the landowner's impeccable suit. "Mr. Rivera," she responded, maintaining a prudent distance, "I wonder if you could grant me a few minutes of your time," he continued, with the confidence of one who rarely receives refusals. "I have a matter to discuss of a personal nature." Curiosity overcame initial caution. Maite agreed to accompany him to the small plaza, where the trees offered a respite from the persistent August heat. They sat on a stone bench, maintaining between them a distance that respected social conventions. "I'll get straight to the point, Miss Solano," Rivera began, meticulously adjusting his fine leather gloves. "I am aware of your situation and the difficulties you face. My situation is no secret to anyone in Frontera do Riacho," she responded with certain dryness. A calculated smile appeared briefly on Rivera's lips. "Precisely, and that's why my proposal might interest you." The expensive perfume emanating from him contrasted with the aroma of dry earth and wild herbs that Maite associated with her current life. Something in that olfactory dissonance put her on alert. "I'm listening," she said, though a part of her already anticipated what would come. "I offer you marriage, Miss Solano," he declared with the same intonation he would have used to propose a business deal. "A marriage that would guarantee financial security for you and your unborn children." Maite held her breath, surprised not by the proposal itself, but by the coldness with which it had been formulated. "Why?" she asked directly. Rivera seemed to appreciate her frankness. "I need an heir for my fortune, or in your case, heirs. I am 45 years old, Miss Solano, and the loneliness of success begins to weigh. Your intelligence and determination are qualities I appreciate, and your knowledge of natural medicine could be valuable for my estate. And Mr. Valdez?" The question escaped her lips before she could contain it. An expression of disdain briefly crossed Rivera's face. "Mr. Valdez can maintain his paternal rights, if he so wishes." But your children would bear my surname and would be educated as befits the heirs of the Rivera estate. The silence that followed was charged with implications. A flock of pigeons took flight from the church bell tower, their wings beating in unison against the clear sky. I don't need love, just an heir, concluded Rivera, interpreting her silence as consideration of the offer. Maite observed her own hands, slightly calloused from working with herbs and caring for her small garden. Hands that knew the value of work, that had learned to sustain themselves. I appreciate your offer, Mr. Rivera, she finally responded, but I must decline it. The surprise on the man's face was genuine, as if the possibility of a rejection had never entered his calculations. Do you understand what you're rejecting? He asked, with a tone that oscillated between incredulity and something close to reluctant admiration. Security, social position, education for your children. I understand perfectly, affirmed Maite with serenity, but I also understand what I would accept. A life based on convenience, not on mutual respect or affection. Rivera studied her with renewed interest, as if he were re-evaluating the value of something he had initially underestimated. You are an uncommon woman, Miss Solano, he finally commented. Your answer confirms to me that my instinct about your character was correct. He rose with the practiced elegance of one who has occupied positions of power all his life. Before saying goodbye, he added, My offer remains open. Sometimes with time, practicality overcomes idealism. Maite observed his figure moving away toward the waiting carriage. Rivera's words resonated in her mind, not as a temptation, but as a reminder of the values that guided her decisions. That afternoon, while returning to the cabin with her carefully packaged herbs, Maite passed by the construction that Ernesto continued patiently erecting. The walls were already complete, and the roof was beginning to take shape. It wasn't a mansion like Rivera's, not even a house that would impress anyone in town, but each board had been placed with care, each nail hammered with purpose. Ernesto greeted her from atop the roof, his figure silhouetted against the sunset sky. He didn't ask where she had been or what she had done. His trust, silent but constant, was a marked contrast to Rivera's calculated declarations. The house will be ready before the little ones arrive, he commented, nimbly descending the improvised ladder. Maite nodded, aware that Ernesto expected no more response than that. In their shared world, words were valuable precisely because they were used economically, not as currency, but as seeds planted with purpose. While observing the house under construction, with its simple but firm lines, Maite understood that she had already chosen long before Rivera's proposal. She had chosen an uncertain but authentic path, where promises were not declared in grandiloquent terms, but were built day by day, board by board, like the house that gradually took shape before her eyes. The twins moved inside her, as if perceiving her renewed resolution. For the first time in a long time, Maite felt that the future, though unpredictable, contained a different promise than the one Rivera had offered, the promise of an authentic life, built with the same hands that now caressed her belly in a protective and determined gesture. The European-style carriage, with its ornate wheels and embossed leather hood, was as incongruous in the dusty streets of Frontera do Riacho as its occupant. The woman who descended from it, helped by a driver in immaculate livery, seemed to have stepped out of the pages of a fashion magazine from San Francisco or even Paris. Aurora Valdez, for thus she introduced herself to the astonished clientele of the main inn, possessed the same intensity in her gaze as her brother, though in her it was nuanced by a gleam of cosmopolitan sophistication. Her traveling dress, of a deep blue that matched, the twilight beginning to tinge the sky, whispered with each of her measured and elegant movements. "I'm looking for my brother, Ernesto Valdez," she announced, with a voice that, though soft, contained the edge of steel. "And also for Miss Maite Solano." The news of her arrival spread through the town, with the speed that only potential scandals can achieve. Before nightfall, there wasn't a single inhabitant who didn't know of the presence of the taciturn cowboy's sister and her apparent interest. In the future mother of her nephews, Maite received the news from the lips of Doña Clemencia herself, who appeared at the cabin with agitated breathing and an expression that oscillated between concern and malicious curiosity. "She's come from Boston," informed the old woman, accepting with trembling hands the cup of tea Maite offered her. "They say she's the widow of an important banker, and, She doesn't seem to have friendly intentions. Something in the way the matriarch pronounced those words made Maite feel a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze that slipped through the open windows. "Does Ernesto know she's here?" Doña Clemencia shook her head. "She went directly to the inn. She's rented the best room and has sent a formal invitation for both of you to dine with her tonight." The invitation, written on linen paper with impeccable calligraphy, arrived minutes later in the hands of a boy who anxiously awaited a tip. Maite read and reread it, seeking between the lines. Some clue about the intentions of this woman who appeared so suddenly in their lives. Ernesto arrived at dusk, his face more somber than usual. For the first time since Maite had known him, she saw him truly nervous, almost vulnerable. "We don't have to go," he said, passing a hand through his hair still damp from the hasty bath he had taken. Maite, who had spent the last hour debating between her only two presentable dresses, had already made her decision. "I need to meet her, Ernesto. She is family to the twins, after all." Something akin to pain briefly crossed the amber eyes of the man. "Aurora is not what you imagine. She has her own ideas about what is correct." Dinner was served in a private dining room of the inn, illuminated only by candelabra that projected dancing shadows on the white linen tablecloth. Aurora Valdez, seated at the head like a queen presiding over her court, received them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "At last, I meet the woman who has tamed my brother," she said, evaluating Maite with a gaze that seemed to catalogue every imperfection. "When I received Ernesto's letter mentioning your situation, I knew I had to come immediately." The tension was palpable, like an invisible fourth diner seated among them. Dinner proceeded with superficial conversation, where each word seemed to hide second intentions. Aurora subtly interrogated Maite about her family, her education, her prospects, while Ernesto remained unusually silent, as if fearing the revelations that might emerge. It was during dessert, a homemade flan that the innkeeper had prepared especially for the occasion, when Aurora finally showed her cards. "My brother has always been an idealist," she commented, stirring her coffee with precise movements. "Even in Boston, when he was one of society's most promising young men, he had that tendency to complicate his life unnecessarily." Maite observed Ernesto, whose face had become an impenetrable mask. Boston? Society? These pieces didn't fit with the reserved man she knew, the solitary horse-tamer who lived on the margins of town. "Ernesto never mentioned Boston," she commented, trying to maintain a neutral tone. A calculated smile appeared on Aurora's perfectly painted lips. "Oh, there are many things my dear brother doesn't mention." She extracted a yellowed envelope from her purse. "Like this letter, for example." She placed it on the table with a theatrical gesture. "The fiancé he abandoned at the altar, the scandal that forced him to flee westward. They are fascinating stories, aren't they, Ernesto?" The silence that followed was as dense as the morning fog in the valleys. Maite felt that her world, carefully reconstructed over the past months, was beginning to wobble again. "Aurora, enough!" Ernesto's voice sounded more authoritative than Maite had ever heard him. "Enough! I've barely begun, dear brother," she replied, leaning forward. "This young woman deserves to know the truth about the man. She has chosen as the father of her children, don't you think? She deserves to know about Elizabeth Downing, about your broken engagement, about mistakes I've paid for with years of solitude," interrupted Ernesto, rising abruptly. "You didn't come to protect Maite, but to punish me." The tension between the siblings was almost visible, like silent lightning between storm clouds. Maite, feeling the twins stirring inside her as if they perceived the electricity in the atmosphere, instinctively placed a protective hand on her belly. "I think we should continue this conversation at another time," she said, with a calmness she didn't feel. "The babies are restless." The mention of the twins seemed to change something in the dynamic. Aurora, for the first time since her arrival, showed a genuine emotion as she briefly rested her gaze on Maite's belly. "Of course," she conceded, quickly composing herself. "But before—" She extended the letter toward Maite with a gesture that seemed almost a challenge. "Read it when you're alone. You'll better understand the man with whom you've linked your destiny." The path back to the cabin proceeded in a heavy silence. The letter, kept in the pocket of Maite's shawl, seemed to weigh like lead. The stars, unusually bright that night, illuminated the path with an almost cruel clarity, as if the universe itself insisted that hidden truth should come to light. When they arrived, Ernesto stopped on the porch, his tall figure silhouetted against the night sky. He seemed older, as if dinner had extracted years from his life. "Not everything Aurora said is a lie," he finally admitted, "but neither is it the whole truth." Maite nodded, understanding that that night she had witnessed only the prologue of a much more complex story than she had imagined. The man before her, with his silences and his shadows, with his calloused hands and his secret music, was a mystery she was just beginning to unravel. "I'll read the letter," she said simply, "and tomorrow we'll talk." When Ernesto moved away toward his own cabin, Maite remained on the porch, contemplating the stars. The twins, now calm, seemed to give her the strength she needed to face the revelations that dawn would bring. The letter would wait until tomorrow. Tonight she simply needed to breathe under the same sky that had witnessed, imperturbable, generations of secrets, betrayals, and, perhaps also, redemptions. The sky dawned with a leaden tonality. That presaged the first true storm after months of drought. Dark clouds advanced from the horizon, driven by a wind that made the boards of the cabin creak and tore pitiful moans from the surrounding trees. Maite had spent the night reading and rereading Elizabeth Downing's letter, trying to reconcile the refined young man from Boston it described with the taciturn cowboy she knew. The words, written in an elegant but emotion-trembling calligraphy, related a broken engagement, a social scandal, and a man who had fled, leaving behind unfulfilled promises and broken hearts. "Your sudden departure has caused a scandal from which my family will take years to recover. If you truly loved me as you claimed, how could you abandon me so cruelly on the eve of our wedding? Public humiliation is just one part of the pain you have inflicted on me." When the first thunder rumbled in the distance, Maite put the letter in the drawer of the small table beside her bed. Aurora's revelations and Elizabeth's words had opened questions that only Ernesto could answer, but the approaching storm demanded more immediate attention. She went out to the porch to secure the pots with her medicinal herbs and collect the hung laundry that wasn't completely dry yet. The wind, increasingly strong, made her dress undulate and loosened rebellious strands from her braid. From her elevated position, she could see Ernesto's cabin and the structure of the new house, now almost completed. There were no signs of the man, who was probably securing the cattle or reinforcing the stables against the imminent storm. The first drops, thick and cold, began to fall when Maite was finishing storing her belongings. The intensity rapidly increased, transforming the initial drizzle into a downpour that blurred the landscape behind a liquid curtain. It was then that she saw Ernesto running toward the cabin, soaked to the bone, with something wrapped in his jacket that he protected from the rain with evident concern. "Open the door!" he shouted over the roar of the storm. Maite obeyed immediately. Ernesto entered like an exhalation, shaking off the water like a shepherd dog after crossing a river. Carefully, he deposited his burden on the table, a young hawk with a visibly damaged wing. "I found it trapped in one of the fences," he explained, breathless. "The storm knocked it down." The bird, terrified but too weak to struggle, observed the humans with amber eyes, surprisingly similar to Ernesto's. Maite, momentarily forgetting the revelations of the previous night, approached with slow and precise movements. "I'll need clean bandages and something to splint the wing," she murmured, carefully examining the injured animal. "And some of my tinctures to prevent infection." They worked together in silence, complementing each other with a synchronization that seemed natural. Ernesto held the bird with firmness but gentleness, while Maite aligned the bones and applied the bandage. The rain pattered furiously against the roof and windows, isolating them from the outside world as if they were on a desert island. "It will survive," Maite finally declared, observing the now calmer hawk, accommodated in a box padded with soft rags. "But it will need time to heal." Ernesto nodded, tension gradually abandoning his shoulders. It was then that he seemed to realize his condition, soaked, with hair stuck to his forehead and puddles forming at his feet. "You should change," suggested Maite, pointing toward the small screen that separated her sleeping area. "I think I have a shirt that might fit you. The previous doctor left it when he fell ill last winter." While Ernesto changed, Maite prepared coffee on the small wood stove that provided heat to the cabin. The comforting aroma mixed with the smell of wet earth that filtered through the cracks in the windows. "The storm won't abate soon," she commented, when Ernesto reappeared, with the borrowed shirt slightly tight across his broader shoulders than the doctor's. "The stream will probably overflow, cutting the path to your cabin." The implication floated between them. Ernesto would have to stay. The intimacy forced by circumstances created a different tension, more immediate than that provoked by Aurora's revelations. "I read the letter," Maite finally said, serving coffee in 2 chipped cups. "Elizabeth seems to have suffered a lot." Ernesto accepted the cup with a silent nod, his eyes fixed on the dark liquid as if he could read in it answers to questions not yet formulated. "What Aurora didn't show you were my letters to Elizabeth," he finally responded. "The explanations, the apologies, that I never sent." A particularly violent thunder shook the cabin, making the cups tinkle and startling the injured hawk. Maite approached to calm it with gentle caresses. "Why didn't you send them?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Ernesto approached the window, observing the landscape. Transformed by the rain, his profile silhouetted against the greyish light showed a vulnerability he rarely allowed to be glimpsed. "Because words have never been enough for me," he responded in a hoarse voice. "Because I promised too much with words I couldn't back up with actions." He turned to look at her directly, his eyes reflecting a stark honesty. "Elizabeth deserved more than my empty promises. She deserved a man who truly wanted the life her family had planned for us. And you didn't." "Want it? I wanted the idea of her," he admitted. "The idea of belonging to something, of being respected. But when the moment of truth came, I understood that I couldn't live a life dictated by others' expectations." Maite nodded, understanding perfectly. Wasn't that what she herself had rejected in declining Rivera's proposal? Security in exchange for authenticity. The afternoon progressed, while the storm discharged its fury, accumulated over months of drought. They talked as they never had before, sharing fragments of their pasts like pieces of a puzzle that gradually took shape. Ernesto told her about his privileged youth in Boston, about the expectations of a family with rigid traditions, about his flight westward in search of a freedom he hadn't been able to define until finding it. Maite, in turn, shared stories of her mother, of the difficult years after her death, of her determination to build a life based on her own terms. When evening enveloped the cabin in shadows, the rain continued tirelessly. Maite lit oil lamps that projected golden halos on the rustic walls. The intimate atmosphere created by the trembling light and the constant murmur of the rain dissolved the last barriers between them. "What will you do when the twins are born?" asked Maite while they shared a simple dinner of bread, cheese, and dried fruits. Ernesto considered the question with characteristic seriousness. "I will be present," he finally responded. "Not as I was for Elizabeth, with promises I couldn't keep, but with actions, day after day." Their eyes met across the table, and something indefinable passed between them, as tangible as the heat emanating from the stove, but infinitely deeper. That night, while the storm continued its furious symphony on the roof, they slept in rooms separated by barely a fabric screen. However, the true distance between them had diminished more in those shared hours than in all the previous months. The injured hawk, from its improvised box, observed with alert eyes the new equilibrium established between the humans who had rescued it. Like them, it had been knocked down by forces more powerful than its will, but also, like them, it had found an unexpected refuge in the midst of the storm. September arrived with a golden radiance that transformed the fields, now recovered after the rains, into an undulating sea of ochre and yellowish tonalities. Nature seemed to hurry to complete its cycle before the arrival of autumn, with an exuberance that contrasted dramatically with the aridity of previous months. Maite, with her 8th month of pregnancy, making each movement more deliberate, contemplated the change from the porch of the new house. The construction, finally finished, smelled of fresh wood and possibilities. 2 small bedrooms, a common room with fireplace, and a modest but functional kitchen composed the space she would soon call home. The twins moved constantly now, as if competing for space in her extended belly. Sometimes, when she was alone, Maite spoke to them in whispers, sharing her hopes and fears with these beings who already formed part of her world, though they had not yet breathed the air of Frontera do Riacho. The neigh of a horse announced Ernesto's arrival before she could spot him. Since the storm, something had changed between them. The honesty forced by those hours of confinement had created a new type of intimacy, not based on the passion that had initiated their story, but on a deeper and more conscious understanding. I had to go to town, he explained, dismounting with the natural grace that characterized all his movements. Doña Clemencia intercepted me to inform me that Dr. Fuentes will return next week. The news cheered Maite. The itinerant doctor had promised to be present for the birth, but her routes were unpredictable and depended on the needs of communities scattered throughout the territory. I brought this, continued Ernesto, extracting from his saddlebag a package wrapped in brown paper, for the house. Upon unwrapping it, Maite discovered a set of simple but elegant porcelain cups with small blue flowers hand-painted, a modest but significant luxury in a place where practical objects prevailed over decorative ones. "They're precious," she murmured, caressing the delicate edge of one of them. Something in Ernesto's expression, a mixture of pride and vulnerability, reminded her of the child he must have been before life transformed him into the reserved man she had before her. "Shall we try them out?" she proposed, pointing toward the new kitchen where she had already installed the kettle and some basic supplies. While they prepared tea together, moving with the comfortable familiarity they had developed, Maite perceived that Ernesto seemed unusually tense, as if something weighed on his mind. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked, as they sat in the new chairs that smelled of fresh varnish. Ernesto contemplated his cup for a long moment before responding. "There's something I must tell you," he began, his voice deeper than usual. "Something I should have confessed long ago." Maite's heart skipped a beat. After Aurora's revelations, she believed there were no significant secrets left between them. "I'm listening," she said, mentally preparing for any new complication. Ernesto raised his gaze, his amber eyes unusually vulnerable. "I have a son," he declared, "a 10-year-old boy who lives with my cousins in Colorado." The confession fell between them like a stone in a still pond, sending waves of disturbance in all directions. Maite felt the air leave her lungs. "A son?" she repeated, trying to process the information. "You have a son and never mentioned him." "His mother died in childbirth," continued Ernesto, the words now emerging as if a long-closed floodgate had opened. "I was barely 20, frightened and without resources. My cousins offered to raise him while I found my way." He paused, his hands gripping the cup as if seeking to anchor to something tangible. "The years passed. I sent money regularly, but never found the courage to visit him." The silence that followed weighed with all the implications of this revelation. Maite struggled against contradictory emotions, understanding toward the frightened young man Ernesto had been, disappointment with the man who had evaded his responsibility, and a new concern about what this meant for the twins growing in her womb. "What's his name?" she finally asked, surprising herself with the question. "Daniel," replied Ernesto, an unexpected softness coloring the word. "He resembles my father, according to my cousin's letters." Ernesto placed the cup on the table with a deliberate gesture. "Because I don't want to repeat my mistakes," he said simply. "Because these children," he pointed to Maite's belly, "deserve more than half-truths and half-commitments." He stood and walked to the window, where the golden light of dusk drew his silhouette with almost mythical contours. "I've written to my cousins," he continued. "I've asked them to bring Daniel after the twins' birth. I want to meet my son. I want him to meet his siblings." The magnitude of this decision, this fundamental change in the life they had begun to build together, left Maite momentarily speechless. The image of an unknown child, half stranger, half familiar, integrating into their fragile family equilibrium, was as challenging as unexpected. "What, if he rejects you?" she asked, giving voice to the fear that clearly tormented Ernesto. 10 years have passed. "Then I'll have to earn him day by day, as I try to earn your trust," he replied, turning to face her. "I don't expect him to forgive me immediately, nor to accept me as his father. I just want the opportunity to try." The raw honesty of his words touched something deep in Maite. This man, who had fled from his responsibilities in the past, now faced them voluntarily, not only with the twins but with the son he had abandoned. She rose with effort, her body increasingly uncomfortable with the weight of the babies, and approached Ernesto. Without words, she took his hand and placed it on her belly, right where one of the twins was delivering particularly vigorous kicks. "Feel that," she murmured. "It's life that doesn't stop, that continues forward despite our mistakes and fears." They remained thus for a long moment, connected by the incessant movement of a new generation. That would soon arrive in an imperfect world but full of possibilities. "I don't know how it will be when Daniel arrives," Maite finally admitted, "but I know we'll find the way, day by day, as we've done until now." When the sun began to sink behind the hills, casting elongated shadows over the land recovered after the drought, Maite and Ernesto remained by the window, not as passionate lovers, not even as uncomplicated friends, but as two people who had consciously chosen to face together, whatever the future might bring, with all its complexities and challenges. The song of the crickets marked the beginning of another night in Frontera do Riacho, another pause in a story that, like the earth itself, continued transforming with each season. The fundraising event for the twins transformed the central plaza of Frontera do Riacho into a hive of activity. Long tables covered with white tablecloths exhibited homemade cakes, preserves, crafts, and all kinds of objects donated for the auction. Garlands of colored paper swayed among the trees, adding a festive touch that contrasted with the town's usual solemnity. Maite observed the scene with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. The same community that months ago had whispered about her improper situation, now united to ensure that the Solano Valdez twins would have everything necessary for their arrival. "It's extraordinary what a little time can achieve," commented Dr. Fuentes, who had returned just in time to participate in the celebration. "A few months ago you were the talk of the town, now you're practically a local institution." Maite smiled, caressing her belly where the twins seemed to have temporarily calmed. "I think it has more to do with fascination with the twins than with a genuine change in attitude," she responded, though without bitterness. Doña Clemencia approached them, her usual severity slightly softened by the occasion. "They're looking for you at the antique shop," she informed. "It seems they found something that might interest you among the donations." Intrigued, Maite headed toward the small shop that normally sold family relics and second-hand furniture. The interior, always in twilight, smelled of old wood and yellowed paper. Mr. Jimenez, the proprietor, received her with an exaggerated bow that would have seemed comical in anyone else. "Miss Solano," he greeted, rubbing his hands with evident enthusiasm. "Among the donations for the little ones we found. Something peculiar, something I think you should see before it's publicly exhibited." He led her to the back room, where a carved wooden chest, clearly antique but well preserved, rested on a table. Its lid was decorated with floral motifs that Maite recognized immediately. They were identical to those on the cameo that Doña Clemencia had given her. "This chest belonged to the Ortiz family for generations," explained Jimenez. "It was donated anonymously for the auction, but while cleaning it, for the exhibition we found this." With reverential movements, the man extracted from the interior a small leather-bound book, whose yellowed pages were covered by a delicate but firm feminine calligraphy. "A diary," murmured Maite, feeling a shiver of anticipation run down her back. "Of your grandmother, if I'm not mistaken," confirmed Jimenez. "Soledad Ortiz." With trembling hands, Maite accepted the diary. The worn leather felt warm beneath her fingers, as if it retained the heat of hands that had held it decades ago. "I thought you should see it in private," added the shopkeeper, discreetly withdrawing. "I'll have a coffee in the square. Take the time you need." When left alone, Maite sat on a stool by the window, where the afternoon light created a perfect golden circle for reading. Upon opening the diary, a dried flower, possibly a wild rose, fell between the pages. The faint aroma of lavender and thyme rose from the paper, like a greeting across the decades. The first entries revealed a young woman similar to Maite herself, curious, determined, passionate about medicinal plants and natural cures. But it was a particular entry, dated spring 1856, that completely captured her attention. "Today I saw him again. He was taming that black horse that no one had managed to ride. His hands, so gentle despite their evident strength, seemed to speak a language that only the animal understood. Antonio Valdez may not possess lands or titles, but he possesses a natural nobility that my father, with all his fortune, will never understand." The name made Maite hold her breath. Valdez, could it be? She rapidly advanced through the pages, following the story of a forbidden love between Soledad Ortiz, daughter of the most prominent family in Frontera do Riacho, and Antonio Valdez. a worker with no possessions other than his talent with horses and his guitar. A has given me a small horse carved in wood. I'll hide it in the lining of my pillow to feel it close when I dream of a different life, far from these walls that close around me like a golden cage. The similarities with her own story were too evident to ignore. The diary continued narrating clandestine meetings, promises whispered under moonlight, and finally, the inevitable confrontation with Soledad's family. Clemencia has betrayed me. I confided my secret to her, believing my sister would understand true love. Instead, she ran to tell our father. Tonight there were shouts, threats, tears. They have forbidden me to see A again, under threat of sending him to prison with false accusations. How can they call this cruelty that destroys my only chance of happiness, family love? The entries became more desperate, more fragmented, until a final note, written in trembling calligraphy, I am expecting A's child. When my father discovers it, there will be no place for me in this house. Antonio has proposed we flee together toward the north, where he has relatives. We will meet tomorrow at dawn by the great oak. A new life begins for us three. The diary ended abruptly there. Maite turned the remaining pages, all blank, feeling an inexplicable void at the unfinished story. Had Soledad and Antonio managed to escape, or had they been separated by the intervention of the Ortiz family? The last page contained something different, a small pencil sketch showing a young man holding a guitar. Though rudimentary, the drawing captured an expression in the eyes of the portrayed that was disturbingly familiar. The same eyes that Ernesto directed toward the horizon when he thought no one was observing him. Maite closed the diary, overwhelmed by the implications. If Antonio Valdez was an ancestor of Ernesto, perhaps his grandfather or great-grandfather, and Soledad Ortiz was her own grandmother then, the shop door opened, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of Ernesto cut against the exterior light. "I was looking for you," he said, advancing toward her. "The auction is about to begin." Maite held the diary against her chest, unsure of how to share her discovery. "Ernesto," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I think you should see this." She handed him the book open to the page with the sketch. Ernesto observed it with initial curiosity that gradually transformed into something deeper as his eyes scanned the words written decades ago. "Antonio Valdez," he murmured. "My grandfather was named Antonio. And this," Maite pointed to an earlier entry, "was my grandmother, Soledad Ortiz." Understanding slowly drew on Ernesto's face. "Are you saying that our grandparents loved each other," completed Maite, "and were separated, apparently? Your grandfather must have continued his path without her, eventually forming another family. And now generations later." Ernesto left the phrase unfinished, as if words were insufficient to express the strange circularity of destiny that had reunited them. Maite placed a hand on her belly, where the twins seemed to have awakened again, moving with unusual energy. "History doesn't repeat exactly," she said. "This time it's different. This time no one will separate us." When they returned to the square, where the community awaited them to begin the auction, they did so with a new understanding of the invisible threads that had interwoven their lives long before their first encounter in the saloon. The diary, now safely kept in the pocket of Maite's dress, weighed like a promise, the possibility of completing a story that had been interrupted decades ago, of closing a circle that time and circumstances had kept open for too long. The first snow of November transformed Frontera do Riacho into a dreamlike landscape, where each branch and each roof appeared delineated in immaculate white. The intense cold had arrived early this year, as if nature compensated the months of drought with a premature and rigorous winter. Maite, in her 9th month of pregnancy, observed the slowly falling snowflakes from the window of the new house where they had finally settled. Her belly, now enormous, seemed to contain an entire universe that would soon be revealed to the world. The last weeks had brought unexpected changes. Dr. Fuentes, concerned about certain symptoms Maite had begun to experience, frequent dizziness, swelling in the extremities, occasionally blurry vision, had recommended absolute rest and constant vigilance. "Twin pregnancies always carry more risks," she had explained, with professional frankness. "And your blood pressure is higher than I'd like." Ernesto, alarmed by the diagnosis, had made a decision that surprised the entire community. He sold Centella, his most valuable mare, to finance a trip to the big city where specialists could attend to Maite. "It's not necessary," she had protested, moved but concerned about the sacrifice it represented for a man whose freedom was intrinsically linked to his horses. "Dr. Fuentes is perfectly capable. I won't." "Take risks," he had responded, with that quiet determination that admitted no discussion. "Not with you three." The trip, however, proved revealing for unexpected reasons. Dr. Martinez, a specialist with European training, performed a more detailed examination using instruments that Dr. Fuentes did not possess. "It's not hypertension that concerns me," he declared, after an exhaustive review. "The twins share the same placenta, a relatively rare condition that can cause complications if not monitored adequately." The news had provoked contradictory feelings, relief at knowing that Maite's condition was not as serious as feared, but new concern about this special characteristic of her pregnancy. "Identical twins," Ernesto had murmured during the return journey, the wonder evident in his normally contained voice. Two beings exactly alike. Now, while snowflakes danced hypnotically in front of the window, Maite reflected on this new revelation. Identical twins, born from a single egg that had divided, sharing not only the same blood but the exact same origin, a miracle within another miracle. The creaking of the door announced Ernesto's arrival, loaded with firewood for the fireplace. His movements, always efficient, revealed a new urgency since they had returned from the city, as if each completed task, maintaining the fire lit, securing provisions, reinforcing the house against the cold, was a small battle won against the uncertainties of the future. "The snow is worsening," he commented, shaking the flakes from his hair and jacket. "The path to town will be impassable by tomorrow." The concern in his voice was evident. The probable date of birth approached, and the possibility of being isolated by snow added a new layer of anxiety to the weight. "Dr. Fuentes promised to come before the storm worsens," Maite reminded him, trying to project a calmness she didn't completely feel. "And Doña Clemencia has assisted more births than anyone in the county." Ernesto nodded, kneeling to kindle the fire. The flames grew, projecting their golden light over the room and creating dancing shadows on the newly whitewashed walls. The contrast between the exterior cold and the welcoming warmth of home seemed to symbolize the fragility of the life they had built, a precious but vulnerable refuge against the elements. "Have you thought of names?" asked Ernesto, sitting beside her on the small sofa they had acquired with part of the money raised at the community event. Maite smiled, surprised by the question. Between medical concerns and practical preparations, they had barely discussed this fundamental aspect. "For a girl, I had thought of Soledad," she replied, the name of her grandmother now charged with new meanings since the discovery of the diary. "And for a boy, Antonio," completed Ernesto, a faint smile illuminating his normally serious features. "But there are two. We'll need another name." Maite caressed her belly thoughtfully. "If they're two boys, the second could be called Manuel, like my father. And if they're two girls, Elena," suggested Ernesto with a soft voice. "It was my mother's name." A particularly strong movement inside Maite interrupted the conversation, as if the twins wanted to participate in the decision about their names. Both laughed, a shared laugh that momentarily dissolved the anxiety of waiting. The wind increased outside, making the windows creak and sending gusts of snow that struck the glass like small ghostly fingers. The storm, forecast as passing, seemed to intensify with each passing hour. "We should prepare for the possibility that the doctor can't arrive," Maite finally said, expressing the fear that had been growing in both. Ernesto nodded, his tense jaw reflecting his concern. "I've seen colts and calves born," he commented, as if trying to convince himself. "And Doña Clemencia promised to come at the first indication the babies are on their way." "The babies will be born when they're ready," replied Maite with a serenity that surprised even herself. "With doctor or without, women have been giving birth since the beginning of time." As the afternoon progressed toward an early night, typical of the incipient winter, Maite felt the first indications. A dull pain in the lower back, different from the usual discomforts of recent months. She said nothing, watching the clock and waiting to confirm her suspicions before alarming Ernesto. It had barely darkened when the pains acquired a recognizable pattern, gradually increasing in intensity. Only then did she share the news. "It has begun," she said simply, interrupting Ernesto as he carved another small wooden animal for the collection he had created for the twins. Ernesto's expression changed instantly, passing from initial bewilderment to understanding, and finally to a mixture of determination and barely contained terror. "I'll send someone to town," he declared, heading for the door. "No!" Maite's voice, firmer than the situation warranted, stopped him in his tracks. "The storm is too strong. I won't risk anyone else's life." As if to confirm her words, a particularly violent gust shook the house, making the lamps oscillate and stirring the flames in the fireplace. The hours that followed acquired an almost dreamlike quality. Time seemed to expand and contract to the rhythm of Maite's contractions. Ernesto moved with silent efficiency, heating water, preparing clean cloths, following instructions that Maite gave him between increasingly intense pains. At midnight, when the storm reached its peak, turning the outside world into a white chaos of wind and snow, a knock at the door startled them both. Doña Clemencia entered like an apparition, covered in snow from head to foot, followed by Dr. Fuentes. Both women seemed exhausted but determined. "Did you think we would leave you alone at a time like this?" declared the old woman, divesting herself of her soaked cape. "I've crossed worse storms for less important reasons." The arrival of the women brought with it a new confidence. The doctor examined Maite with precise and professional movements. "You're progressing rapidly," she confirmed. "The twins are in a hurry to meet the world." The following hours passed in a haze of pain, effort, and determination. Maite, lying on the bed she would eventually share with Ernesto, though they hadn't explicitly discussed it yet, gave herself to the ancient ritual of birth. Ernesto remained at her side, holding her hand, cleaning the sweat from her forehead, murmuring words of encouragement that probably he himself didn't completely understand. His eyes, normally reserved, revealed a vulnerability and admiration that transformed his habitually austere face. When the clock marked 3 in the morning, the first cry broke the monotonous rhythm of the storm. A boy, small but with surprisingly strong lungs, emerged into the world with an indignant cry that drew tears from all present. "Antonio," murmured Maite, exhausted but radiant, while the doctor briefly placed the newborn on her chest before continuing with her work. Minutes later, the second twin made his appearance, with less drama but equal determination. Another boy, identical to the first down to the small birthmark in the shape of a half-moon at the base of the neck, a detail that Ernesto immediately noticed. "Just like my father and grandfather," he whispered, his voice broken with emotion. "The same mark." "Manuel," declared Maite, completing the naming ritual while observing her sons being cleaned and wrapped in the blankets she had knitted during the long months of waiting. Outside, as if responding to the miracle that had just occurred inside the modest house, the storm began to abate. The wind, which had howled like a wounded animal for hours, gradually yielded until becoming a barely audible murmur. When dawn began to filter its grayish light through the frost-covered windows, Maite held her, sons in each arm, marveling at the miracle of their perfect existences. Ernesto sat beside her on the bed, his solid and protective presence creating a refuge that no storm could penetrate. Doña Clemencia and Dr. Fuentes, exhausted but satisfied, discreetly withdrew to the living room, leaving the new family a moment of intimacy. "They're perfect," murmured Ernesto, touching with reverence the tiny hands that seemed to seek something to grasp. "They're ours," replied Maite, the simplicity of her words containing truths too deep to be expressed in any other way. In that moment of perfect stillness, while the dawn light transformed the room, bathing it in silver and gold tonalities, Maite understood that the circle initiated generations ago by Soledad and Antonio had finally been completed. The interrupted story of their grandparents found continuity in these two small beings that combined their blood and their heritage. The snow continued falling outside, but now it did so with gentleness, like a silent blessing upon the land renewed after the violence of the storm. Spring arrived in Frontera do Riacho with an explosion of colors and aromas that seemed more intense after the particularly severe winter. Wildflowers sprouted even in the most unexpected places, as if the earth itself celebrated the annual rebirth with renewed enthusiasm. Exactly 1 year after that stormy revelation in the saloon, the town square presented a festive appearance. Garlands of fresh flowers and colored ribbons adorned the trees and posts, while long tables covered with white tablecloths awaited the guests who began to congregate. Maite, in a light blue dress that matched the clear sky, observed the final preparations while gently rocking Manuel, who dozed against her shoulder. A few steps away, Ernesto held Antonio with the same mixture of pride and reverential fear that had characterized each interaction with his sons during the 3 months that had passed since their birth. The Zaum, twins identical down to the minutest details, except for the tiny ribbon bracelets, red for Antonio, blue for Manuel, that identified them, had become the undisputed celebrities of Frontera do Riacho. Their baptism, organized by Doña Clemencia with a generosity that had surprised everyone, promised to be the social event of the year. "They look precious," commented Aurora Valdez, approaching with the elegance that characterized her, though now softened by a genuine warmth. The revelations of the previous year had initiated a complex but gradually healing relationship between the Valdez siblings. Maite nodded, thanking for the compliment with a smile. The first months of motherhood had been a constant challenge, with sleepless nights and days of accelerated learning. However, they had also brought an inner peace she had never experienced before. "Has he arrived yet?" she asked, aware of the tension that Ernesto tried to disguise while constantly scanning the entrance to the square. Aurora shook her head. "The train should have arrived an hour ago, but you know how these things are in frontier territories. They'll arrive in time, don't worry." The "they" to which she referred were the cousins from Colorado, and more importantly, Daniel, the 10-year-old son that Ernesto had never met. After months of carefully drafted correspondence, they had agreed that the twins' baptism would be the perfect occasion for this long-postponed meeting. Ernesto had dedicated the last weeks to an almost frantic preparation, expanding the house to include an additional room, carving more elaborate wooden toys, even practicing imaginary conversations with the child he knew only through letters and a yellowing photograph. "He's nervous," he had confessed to Maite the night before. "What if he hates me? He has every right." "He'll give you the opportunity to meet him," she had responded. "And that's all you need. An opportunity." The sound of an approaching carriage attracted everyone's attention. Ernesto visibly tensed, his knuckles white from gripping the small wooden horse he had carved as a welcome gift for Daniel. From the vehicle descended first a middle-aged woman with features that vaguely recalled Ernesto's, followed by a corpulent man. Finally, a thin boy with dark hair got down with cautious movements, his eyes, identical to Ernesto's, scanning the crowd until stopping on the man who held a baby. The silence that followed seemed to contain the collective breath of the entire town. Maite took Antonio from Ernesto's arms, allowing him to advance toward the boy who observed him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Daniel," said Ernesto, his voice barely audible, I'm your father." The boy nodded, as if confirming something he already knew but needed to verify in person. "You look like the photo that Aunt Martha keeps in her Bible," he responded, with a seriousness improper for his age. Ernesto knelt, coming to the child's eye level. With almost timid movements, he offered him the carved horse. "I made it for you. If you don't like it, I can make another. Any animal you prefer." Daniel took the figure, examining it with the care of one accustomed to valuing the few gifts he receives. His fingers traveled over the meticulously carved lines, stopping at the details of the mane and muscles. "It's nice," he finally declared. "Can you teach me to make one?" The question, simple but loaded with implications, caused something to break in. Ernesto's habitually controlled expression. They weren't words of forgiveness that would require time and actions, not just intentions, but of openness, of possibility. "I'd love to," he responded, his voice slightly trembling. Maite observed the exchange with a full heart. This boy, who had grown up without a father, now had the opportunity to meet not only his progenitor, but also his little brothers. The family they were forming was unusual, complex, marked by absences and reunions, but no less valuable for that. The baptism ceremony proceeded with the solemnity that the occasion merited. Little Antonio and Manuel, surprisingly calm despite the crowd, received the baptismal water with almost identical expressions of bewilderment. Daniel, designated as honorary godfather along with Aurora, observed the ritual with solemn fascination. When the formal part concluded, the celebration transformed into a community party that extended until dusk. The entire town participated, as if the birth of the twins had represented not only an addition to the Solano Valdez family, but a renewal for all of Frontera do Riacho. As the sun began its descent, tinting the sky with orange and purple tonalities, Maite briefly moved away from the crowd. She needed a moment of stillness to assimilate the magnitude of the changes that the last year had brought to her life. She headed toward the great oak that dominated the gentle hill on the outskirts of town. This was the tree mentioned in her grandmother's diary, the meeting point where Soledad and Antonio had planned to begin their escape toward a new life. Upon arriving, she discovered she wasn't alone. Ernesto was already there, contemplating the horizon with a thoughtful expression. Daniel, a few steps from him, was throwing stones toward an invisible point in the distance. "May I join you?" she asked, aware of potentially interrupting an important moment. Ernesto welcomed her with a smile, those gestures that were once so rare, but that the twins had managed to provoke with increasing frequency. "I was telling Daniel about this tree," he explained, "about its history." The boy, who initially had maintained a prudent distance from all adults except his aunt and uncle, now seemed more relaxed. "He says this is where his grandfather and your grandmother were going to run away together," he commented, with the frankness characteristic of childhood. Maite nodded, resting a hand on the rough bark of the centennial oak. "This tree has seen many stories begin and end," she responded. "Some sad, others happy. And ours?" Daniel suddenly asked, his gaze alternating between Maite and Ernesto. "Is our story sad or happy?" The question, formulated with the brutal simplicity that only children possess, contained centuries of philosophy in a few words. Maite exchanged a look with Ernesto, seeing in his eyes the same understanding she felt. This child, with his seemingly simple question, had touched the very core of human existence. "Our story," Maite finally responded, choosing each word with care, "is like this oak. It has roots that extend into the past. Some parts are twisted by storms it has survived, but it continues growing toward the sun. And most importantly," she added, extending a hand toward Daniel, "it continues offering new branches." The boy considered the response with the seriousness that seemed to characterize him. After a moment he nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation. "The babies are with the old lady," he informed, changing the subject with the fluidity proper to his age. "She said she could show me how to play the piano if I wanted." "Doña Clemencia," Maite gently corrected. "She's your great-aunt, actually, and she's an excellent pianist." Daniel seemed to process this new information about his kinship with the formidable matriarch of the town. "Can I go, then?" "Of course," replied Ernesto. "We'll catch up soon." When the boy moved away, trotting downhill, Maite and Ernesto were left alone under the oak that had witnessed so many beginnings and endings. The setting sun projected their elongated shadows on the new grass, merging them into a single indistinguishable form. "1 year," murmured Ernesto, breaking the contemplative silence. "It seems a lifetime." "And just the beginning," replied Maite, intertwining her fingers with his, in a gesture that had become natural with time. They looked at each other then, really looked at each other, as they had seldom allowed themselves to do. In Ernesto's eyes, Maite saw the frightened young man who had fled from Boston, the solitary cowboy who had found refuge in silence, the first-time father overwhelmed by responsibility and wonder. In Maite, Ernesto saw the determined young woman who had confronted him in the saloon, the healer who knew the secrets of the earth, the mother who had brought his sons into the world in the midst of a storm. They needed no words for what followed. Their lips met in a kiss that contained unspoken promises, but more binding than any formal oath. The spring wind whispered among the oak leaves, as if applauding this moment of perfect connection. When they finally separated, Maite noticed that something had subtly changed in the quality of the light. The sun, in its descent, projected rays that seemed specifically directed at them, like golden fingers blessing their union. "We should return," said Ernesto, though without making a move to leave. "They'll be waiting for us?" Maite nodded, but she too made no attempt to move away. This moment under the tree that connected their story with past and future generations seemed too precious to abandon prematurely. "We have time," she responded simply, and so they remained, their silhouettes cut against the twilight sky, while Frontera do Riacho continued its celebration in the distance. The sounds of music and laughter reached them as a reminder that life, with all its complications and surprises, continued its inexorable course. When they finally descended the hill, they did so with the quiet certainty of those who have found their place in the world, not a final destination, but a shared path. The party was still in full swing. Daniel had found playmates among the town children. The twins passed from arm to arm, receiving blessings and good wishes from each inhabitant. Aurora and Doña Clemencia, improbable allies united by love for the newborns, supervised the events with surprisingly similar expressions of satisfaction. Maite and Ernesto reintegrated into the celebration, received with renewed toasts and congratulations. While the night advanced and the stars appeared one by one in the velvet sky, Maite understood that she had found something she never believed possible, not just a physical home, but an emotional home, a safe harbor amid life's storms. Little Antonio, now in her arms again, yawned widely before opening his eyes, so similar to his father's and older brothers, to contemplate her with that instinctive recognition gaze that always caused a lump in her throat. "Welcome to the world, little one," she whispered, knowing that the same words applied to all of them, to the twins who were just beginning their journey, to Daniel who was rediscovering his family history, to Ernesto who was learning to be the man he had always wanted to be, and to herself, reborn through all she had gained and lost in the last year. The night advanced, but in Frontera do Riacho, under the starry mantle that had witnessed so many interwoven stories, a new story was just beginning to be written, word by word, day by day, heartbeat by heartbeat.